Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us today. Conservation International has been a close partner to the Philanthropy Asia Alliance, and we are pleased to support its summit this year. Well, this afternoon, we've brought together experts who will share their views with you on mobilizing transformative finance for nature restoration with a focus on freshwater conservation. Please allow me to invite my colleague, Saurav Malhotra, Founding Managing Director of the Mountains to Mangroves Initiatives, to kick things off. Saurav, please.
Thank you, everyone. I know it's our panel before maybe some drinks, because it's the closing of the day, but I'm super happy to see many faces in this room and many familiar faces. So I'm going to start talking about what is already a complicated topic, so mobilizing big finance for nature. I'm going to start talking about this in a place of the world that is almost as, if not a little bit more complicated. This place is called the Eastern Himalayas, and I'm going to set this introduction up by allowing you to see a short video about why we do what we do in the region, and then tell you a bit about what we can collectively do to transform the face of climate resilience here.
This is the planet's greatest untold story of nature and people, from the world's tallest mountains to the world's largest mangrove forest and the world's most densely populated treasure trove of biodiversity. It's a story from Bangladesh, from Bhutan, from India, from Nepal. 1 year ago, Conservation International started work with partners on a bold vision to halt deforestation in the region.
And 1 year on, we have the big news.
Introducing Mountains to Mangroves, Conservation International's partnership with the people of the Eastern Himalayas. All across the region, trees are now going into the ground. We have kick-started the first wave of our work that will see 60,000 hectares protected and restored. This is the first step on a journey that will see 1 billion new trees planted, protecting and restoring 1 million hectares of forest land. We are doing this for nature and our beautiful wildlife. We are doing this for our people, and we are ready to share our story with the world. From the mountains to the mangroves, we're just getting started.
I'm not sure how many of you have actually heard about the Eastern Himalayas. I don't think many. I know that there's maybe 10 in this room who know about the region because they've heard about it from us. So the Eastern Himalayas is exactly that map that you see on your screen. You'll see a couple of countries there, but what we can tell you for sure is that this region ranges from the world's tallest mountains. You see the snow-capped peaks, and it starts at the world's tallest mountains, giving rise to some of the biggest rivers on this planet. The biggest rivers on this planet form the greatest delta in Bangladesh, and this greatest delta on Earth is guarded by the world's largest mangrove ecosystem that spans between India and Bangladesh. Between these mountains and the mangroves live about 280 million people, and also 12% of the entire world's biodiversity, making this the most densely populated treasure trove of biodiversity anywhere on the planet. This region, especially the fresh water that originates from the region, feeds more than 1 billion people between South and Southeast Asia. These are all the species that you find in the Eastern Himalayas, including the Royal Bengal tiger. We've missed the photo. But the Eastern Himalayan region, over the last 20 years or so, has lost about 10% of its primary forests. This local-scale deforestation, combined with global warming, melting glaciers, is making life and livelihoods for the 270 million people who live in this region next to impossible. More than 70% of all the people who live here are dependent on nature for livelihoods and live along the rivers. So imagine these rivers now gushing with more water and flooding farms, preventing people from carrying out their daily agricultural work. Imagine storms rushing up the Bay of Bengal into the coastal areas of India and Bangladesh, making lives for the coastal communities harder than ever before. What we at CI launched 2 years ago, Mountains to Mangroves, was the first strategic transboundary effort of its scale in the region. We didn't establish an office in India and say that, hey, we'll now become the biggest tree planting agency. We identified what the best solutions were in India, in Nepal, in Bhutan, in Bangladesh. We partnered with 6 leading organizations who have decades of experience and proven impact on nature and people through nature. And we decided to create a joint ambition for scale. We brought organizations together, we got governments together, and we said, hey, in this most important decade for action on nature on this planet, why don't we collectively restore and protect 1 million hectares of land? We decided that this number should be 1 million hectares. A, it's a big number. B, it's also the number of, or the amount of primary forest hectares that we've lost in about the last 2 decades in the region. The actual need for restoration in the region is far greater, but a 1 million ambition will set the tone for the acceleration of impact work in the region. This collective strategy is what CI hosts and holds and executes through partners in the region. This, again, is our region of focus. The red boundary is the extent of the ambition of the Mountains to Mangroves program, and it is CI's strategy to execute this through what we call the Mountains to Mangroves Atlas. So through the Atlas, we essentially are mapping what will be the most important landscapes in the region for restoration and protection work, and where restoration and protection work will have the most amount of impact on biodiversity, on climate resilience, on freshwater ecosystems, as well as on carbon storage. Our first wave of maps look like this. These initial maps are telling us exactly where deforestation has happened in the region over the last 2 decades, and I think more importantly, guiding us towards where new restoration efforts have to go. But that is just the beginning. This is not a tree planting program, as I've mentioned. We've been working with organizations who work to restore farmlands, working with organizations who work with indigenous landowners to define what community conserved areas should mean and what sustainable forestry looks like in the current day and age. We also work with partners who actually started off as organizations who run education and healthcare programs in Bangladesh, but they realized that the best way to build resilience for coastal communities was through planting mangroves. Right? So we work with a wide variety of organizations in the region to deliver various different kinds of trees, and it's always about the right tree going into the right place that is causing the right kind of impact for the people who live there. But our guiding star is actually these 4 goals. So the goals of ultimately creating climate resilience in the region, the goal of ensuring that every landscape that we restore in this most densely populated place on Earth creates communities that are better off and thriving at the end of this decade, ensuring that in this landscape, which actually is or contains home to many of the world's most important headwaters, that we can create a system by which water is available for people to use for agriculture and for everything else, and that we create space for the 12% of the entire world's biodiversity that lives with all of these people. This work started with baby steps. All the colors that you see across this map are the provinces where we started work over the last 2 years. This work has been possible because our partners had projects that were ready to scale. And this work was possible thanks to the initial support that we received from actually some people in the room, thanks to S&P, thanks to MasterCard, that we could kickstart restoration and conservation work in the region. But this is just the very beginning. What I want to spend a little bit more time on today is actually this slide. So we talked about work that we've started. We talked about working with organizations who've been in the region for the last 5 decades. We also talked about the mapping strategy through which we at Conservation International are figuring where future scale work has to be directed so we have the most amount of impact. What you see on this slide is just an idea of the direction where we are headed. Together with the experience of our partners, together with the experience of CI, we are now designing large-scale opportunities. Right? We want each of these opportunities that we pursue for the rest of this decade to be able to individually impact at least 50,000 hectares of land at any given region, and be able to scale 10 times that beyond the end of this decade. What these opportunities will allow us and partners and the regions to do and hold and execute are programs of ambition that's never been possible before. Right? Conservation International brings to the region decades of expertise in nature finance, decades of expertise in designing large-scale conservation, especially REDD+ work, and we combine that with great local expertise of working with communities, ensuring the long-term impact that nature delivers to communities, working with local governments to satisfy their long-term priorities, both for nature and climate. It is designing these opportunities that's actually taking up a whole host of our time now. And it's really exciting because you see work that will enable the unlocking of capital to restore whatever land can be restored in the whole nation of Bhutan. This will be work that will allow for indigenous conservation models to scale from 1 state in Northeast India to 7 states in Northeast India. This will also be work that will allow for the Mount Kanchenjunga headwater landscape, which is a landscape spanning India, Nepal, and Bhutan, to be conserved so that fresh water can be delivered to people living downstreams almost in perpetuity. This is work that will allow us to scale mangrove afforestation work and to use that as a solid long-term means to build resilience for coastal fishermen and other coastal communities. Unlocking this work is actually the crux of today's panel, right? So how do we get from funding pilots to scaling work to actually getting to these very, very long-term opportunities, right? What we have already been able to unlock is the initial phase that you see here, right? Through this initial phase, we fund existing work, we fund design work, we fund feasibility work, and we, not only show to the rest of the world that this stuff actually causes impact, but we are also able then to create the enabling conditions for scaling of work. We are transitioning now into the second phase, which is the bridge phase. In this bridge phase, we create financial models. We work with many of you in this room to create models that will prove in the next 3 to 5 years that the scaling of this work is still delivering impact on people, on freshwater, on biodiversity, and on carbon. And it is through the span of the next 3 to 5 years that we establish a long-term financial instrument that will allow nations, that will allow local governments, say in India, to actually fund stuff till full resilience can be built for large-scale ecosystems, right? Now, you have to imagine that it's 4 countries, and it's 4 seemingly complicated countries. Well, like a few are easier than the others. But what we are trying to do for the very first time in this region is to create programs that will last and deliver impact for the very, very long term, and programs that will be embedded with markets to deliver impact beyond grant funding phase. What we're also doing in the meanwhile is trying to get to the world the real stories from the region. What we always end up hearing about nature and people is through big media articles, right? So many of us read the New York Times and we read the BBC. And it is through these voices that we know what's happening in these parts of the world, right? Many of those reporters, by the way, have never been to a state called Nagaland in India, but they're talking about it. What we are trying to do is to train young people who live in this region, train young people who are actually working with our programs on the ground to tell the story of how they live with nature, to tell the story of how the destruction of nature has impacted their lives, and I think most importantly, telling the story of the work as it impacts them in the next few years. Here's just a snapshot of the people that we've trained across India, across Bhutan, across Bangladesh. And I'm going to close today by showing you a video, A, to give you a snapshot of some beautiful landscapes, B, to get to you the true story of what nature means for people in the region, and hopefully using that as a stepping stone for what you'll hear from my colleagues and for our panel discussion.
How would you feel if you became homeless? We can see modernization is creeping out in a very fast pace, and then it is leading our biodiversity to be in threat. We know things are getting chaotic just because we are constructing a lot of new things. We are coming up with improper waste management and then polluting our environment. Such changes has dominated our world since people had changed their notion to meet the civilization. Now, can you tell me, people, can we try to bring change and can we try to bring development in the world with some positive actions, or will we just keep having increasing number of homeless species?
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Saraf. Next, we have Dr. Siti Mariam Yaakob, Senior Director of the International Blue Carbon Institute, who will share with you and challenge your thinking on the boundaries of coastal blue carbon ecosystems. Siti, please.
Thank you, Andrea. That's going to slide. Okay. Hi, how's everyone doing? Good? Fantastic. Okay, so my colleague Sarav has taken you on a journey from mountains to mangroves. He's talked about the urgent need to protect, restore, and conserve these critical ecosystems that are the lifeline of our planet and our people. My name is Dr. Siti, and today I now invite you to dive into the water as I take you on a journey to the blue carbon side of things. I will walk you through how our planet relies on nature being resilient and interconnected to ensure that people and nature continue to thrive. Coastal blue carbon ecosystems, such as mangroves on my left and seagrasses on my right, are highly effective at capturing and storing carbon dioxide. The degradation and conversion of these ecosystems result in the release of large amounts of carbon back into the atmosphere, which then contributes to climate change. And it's estimated that about 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide are released annually due to the conversion and degradation of these coastal ecosystems. That's a lot of carbon dioxide, guys. Protecting and restoring them is key, therefore, to achieving our global climate targets, but just as important to the livelihoods and survival of more than 2 billion people that live in our coastal zones. Threats to blue carbon ecosystems range from coastal development through to poor water quality, pollution, expansion of aquaculture, and of course the effects of climate change, like rising sea temperatures and rising sea levels and increasing sea temperatures. But amidst all of this doom and gloom, I'm telling you now that there is hope. In the last decade alone, we've managed to slow the rate of mangrove loss, thanks to the increased awareness and better management measures in coastal ecosystems. And through the collaboration of scientists, policymakers, and investors, we have identified over 800,000 hectares where mangrove restoration can be intensified. And we also now have a plan for how to finance the restoration and protection of mangroves. That's the Global Mangrove Breakthrough. If you want to Google that, you'll be able to find the treatise there. We've also figured out how to do things a lot better. We have better approaches for restoring mangroves. We have better ways to involve the community and ensure buy-in to these projects. And we have better methods to quickly monitor and detect what's working and what's not. We have made great strides, but we can also take it to the next level and do things so much better. Not just in blue carbon ecosystems, but also in the areas surrounding these coastal zones. To borrow an analogy, we will treat this problem like how we would when we are down with a cold. We take medicine to treat the symptoms in our body, but we also need to make changes in our lifestyle and the environment, more sleep, for example, less caffeine, fresh air, to aid this speedy recovery. And it's the same thing for these ecosystems. So if you look at this picture here, if I'm standing in the mangroves and planting trees, I'm treating the symptoms of mangrove loss in the ecosystem. But what we really need to do is take a step back and look at this bigger picture. And you can see here that just adjacent to the mangroves, there is a huge amount of agriculture, and those ponds, where those ponds currently are, used to all be mangroves as well. So we need to zoom out, look at this bigger picture, and let me illustrate why this is important and how it connects mountains to mangroves. So carbon found in mangroves is not just in the mangrove trees, it's not just in the leaves and the branches and all of the living bits that you see above ground. The carbon is also in the sediments. In fact, quite a lot of it is in the sediments. Keeping these sediments intact actually locks away CO2 for decades. And where does this carbon in these sediments come from? The answer is they come from everywhere. They come from the mountains and the hills, they come from forests upstream, they come from rivers and lakes, and the carbon is carried by water, which is going to be our theme for today, that moves through our landscape to connect these ecosystems before they end up in the sea. And at this interface of land and sea, the carbon gets trapped in coastal blue carbon ecosystems, such as mangroves and seagrass, and that's where they're locked away for the long term. So when the system is in balance, it works very much like a finely tuned conveyor belt. This balance allows for coastal communities and biodiversity to thrive. But of course, as you may have guessed, humans are doing things to upset this balance. Let me illustrate. If you had been paying attention to Saurav's presentation, you will see that I've copied these directly from one of his maps. This is a bird's eye view of a coastal catchment. And the catchment on the left, in red, we can see evidence of deforestation, as Saurav has outlined in his presentation, and land use change. So that's basically the bits where it's not green in color. When trees are removed, soil is left bare, and it gets washed out into rivers, and eventually it ends up in the sea. In a normal situation, mangroves and seagrass and the coastal environment would trap a lot of these sediments. But a deluge like this, caused by things like deforestation, it outstrips the natural ability of mangroves and seagrass to trap these sediments, causing it to travel further into deeper waters and out to the open sea. Now compare that to the catchment in green, which has slightly better mangrove cover. You can see that just the extent of the sediment itself is much less than, it's much reduced compared to the area in red. So forest cover here is relatively intact, and so the quantity of sediment is also significantly less. So nature can deal with the occasional flood, right? It's not a problem. But changing weather patterns increases the frequency of heavy rainfall. And this, combined with increased deforestation, really puts this chain of ecosystems and ultimately their ability to move, trap, and store carbon in great peril. And this is why there is an urgent need, and here I'm challenging how we think about conservation, to start thinking of solutions to these issues at the landscape and seascape scales. This is why mountains to mangroves, sorry, I'm a marine person, so I naturally move the other way around. This is why mountains to mangroves is both novel as well as it is logical, right? Because we need these actions to happen across all of these landscapes to have the impact that we desire. And it's also why we're venturing upstream to understand the role of things like teal carbon, which is carbon in freshwater ecosystems, which my colleague Kashif will talk about after me. And this is why the conservation of blue carbon ecosystems and the actions that we take to protect and restore mangrove forests and seagrass meadows that trap and store carbon needs to happen both inside these ecosystems, which is what we're already doing, as well as outside these ecosystems, which is what we need to be doing. Oops. And I'm not going to sugarcoat this because this is not going to be easy work. The actions that are needed will require us to work together. It will require deep collaboration to coordinate our actions. And we will need to work across sectors as well as across disciplines. And we also need all of these things to happen in order to, we also need to share or combine resources, sorry, I forgot about that, and also innovative financing solutions. But if we can change our thinking around how we manage blue carbon ecosystems, then these healthy, resilient oceans, rich biodiversity, and sustainable livelihoods are within our reach. And achieving the scale that we need in order to make a difference to the coastal communities that rely on these ecosystems, the biodiversity, as well as our planet can be a reality. And I urge you, surely this is a dream that we can all get behind. And if this idea excites you, I invite you to come talk to me at the reception afterwards. And if you want to scan our QR code, you can find out more about the International Blue Carbon Institute on our website. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Siddhi. Next, we have Dr. Kashif Shahad, Director, Freshwater Science and Sustainability of Conservation International. And he's here to share with us what might be the future of freshwater conservation in Asia.
A very small task, right? The future of freshwater conservation in Asia. Hopefully everybody's doing okay. I'm going to build on some of the thoughts that Saurav and Siti shared, and actually talk a little bit about the science behind it as well, and kind of try to draw on the broader lessons we can learn from it. But before I get into that, I wanted to show you all a picture and see if you can guess what this is. I saw this on a field not too long ago. I was there 2 months ago. Would anyone in the audience like to take a guess at what this is? Except Saurabh. Saurabh knows. This is from Mountains to Mangrove. This is from Darjeeling city. I think many people would have know what Darjeeling is because of Darjeeling tea, right? It's very famous. Cables for? No, actually that was my first thought when I saw it, that these are electric cables. These are water supply pipes. So Darjeeling has a formal water supply network, but it was designed to cater for 10 to 15,000 people max. Currently, Darjeeling's population is about 100,000 people. So they came up with this innovative solution. These pipes run all along the city. As you drive through the city, they are going along you, they are going above you, they are going besides you. If some of the folks here are a little bit borderline OCD, and if it's giving you palpitations, I apologize. I had the similar reaction. I have no idea how this is organized, right? But what I see clearly was that eventually these pipes snake out of the city. There's a wildlife reserve right above Darjeeling, and they basically plug into every stream, brook, or spring that's coming out of that protected area to supply the water to the city. It's a stunning visual of a city's dependence on nature for its water. It kind of reminded me while I was there of a patient in a high dependency ward with all sorts of IV leads and tubes running out of them and plugging into a machine to keep them alive. But if I be bluntly honest with you all, we are all plugged into nature for water in much the same way. We might be better at hiding our plumbing than Darjeeling is, but when it comes to our water supply, when it comes to growing our food, when it comes to the biodiversity that supports pollination and fish for the people in different ways, when it comes to our flood and drought regulation and even storing carbon, these systems are running global economy. And when we focus in on Asia, I love this map for the clarity it gives us. It was, I think, done by a high school teacher in 2016 and circulated online. There are more people living in that circle than outside that circle. And actually the number currently is around 4.2 billion people living inside that circle. all of them dependent on freshwater ecosystems in the way I just described, extracting in such a way that is damaging those systems. I can give you some statistics. 75% of the people living in that circle are already water stressed, exposed to flooding and drought, and that number is only worsening as our climate continues to shift. On top of that, when we did a survey of the major lakes and rivers, around 50% of the lakes and rivers, major lakes and rivers, are showing increasing signs of pollution than their baseline records. So we are losing our freshwater ecosystems as well. So for an organization like CI, this begs the question, what's our role in this? And kind of what you heard from Saurav and Siti, we are starting to think of our role in this is finding mechanisms by which we can increase the scale and reach of ecological restoration for protecting our freshwater system. This is the need of the hour. I'm going to break our response into two steps. They are interlinked, but I'll share our experience in both of them and then bring them back together. The first one is how we are learning to scale nature-based solutions for water benefits, and Saurav mentioned a little bit about this. And the second one be how are we stacking it with the other benefits that people need, whether it be food, biodiversity, livelihood, etc. The first one has been a very interesting space to track as a science person. There's been a lot of work going on. Ecological restoration is a relatively young field of science. And there's been a lot of science being done of what techniques work, or how quickly can we restore certain systems, what works in forest ecosystems of different type, temperate or tropical, wetland, etc. In some cases, we have been able to boil down that knowledge down to simplified cartoons, like the one you see there, which shows, on average, how would removal of a forest impact the rainfall falling on that landscape, which will eventually translate into how fresh water becomes available to the communities downstream. I think something that has been happening in parallel is how many corporates have become aware of the water crisis and water questions facing themselves. Many people in this audience are probably more familiar with the sustainability frameworks than I would be, but it has given the means in many cases for companies to identify their risks that they're exposed to, whether for the corporation itself or their supply chains, and in some cases put out clear targets of how they would like to act and what they would like to do to address those risks. What has been very interesting for me is when these two worlds have started to come together. There are certain frameworks out there now, like the volumetric water benefits accounting, which allows us to translate any water stewardship activity into a volume of water. And then these systems have created like third-party verification to give more kind of certainty in the way the calculations are being done. It is a projection, but it's based on ground data in most cases, so that it allows corporates to actually influence action on the ground and support that action on the ground, and then use those numbers against their water risks that they're exposed to. We have been using this for projects in the region. One of the longest running projects that we have in our region is probably in the water source area of Jakarta. In 2008, the land looked something like this. It degraded row crops that were at the periphery of the protected area above Jakarta. And now it's indistinguishable from natural forest area. And much of the support we got in this case was from corporations who were looking for some sort of a volumetric water benefit to come into play. Besides just looking at kind of restoring both ecological form and function, which is an example of this, I think our interest, and my interest specifically, has been how we are actually monitoring these impacts, how quickly they occur on the ground, so kind of continuing to contribute to the knowledge base out there. Another type of nature-based solutions that we are using are more for the benefit of the community. They take an ecological function like a wetland's capacity to purify water and bring that benefit to the community. For those from Singapore, if you have been to Jurong Lake Gardens, you can see a functioning constructed wetland there. These are similar, except to the fact that these are built and maintained by the community. So that lake you are seeing in the bottom, in the center, used to be like a traditional, like a lotus pond. It's very typical in traditional villages, I understand, in China. So it was upgraded with the help of the villagers so that from the houses on the periphery, domestic wastewater drains into that constructed wetland, gets some tertiary treatment before being released into nature. These projects are very good because they're quite discrete. But what really helps us is when we start thinking of them at the landscape scale, which kind of brings me to my second strand of how to accelerate reach and scale, is how are we stacking these benefits? The constructed wetland I just showed you is actually at the periphery of a much larger project that we have at CI. It's our flagship wetland conservation and restoration project in China on Poyang Lake, which is the largest freshwater lake in China. It is a fascinating, hydrologically, it's a fascinating ecosystem. The dry season extent, which is the blue you see on the screen, is slightly larger than Singapore in size, to give you a reference. And during the wet season, it expands dramatically to become 6 times the size of Singapore, approximately. And as it shrinks back, it leaves 102 sublakes that disconnect from the main lake. The yellow blobs you are seeing on the screen are the sublakes that get disconnected. And on these sublakes, a number of visiting birds come. If any of you are bird enthusiasts, I see someone from Saturi in our audience who is supporting us in RG, and Saturi are supporting us on this project. They managed to go with us to see some of these birds. Fascinating. Around 500,000 birds visit this landscape in any given year. And on the lake itself, you have some of the last remaining finless poppers for the freshwater system. You see one jumping out of the water there at the bottom. This area, these sublakes, have also been part of the traditional fishing model. So I always love the ingenuity of people. In this case, the fishermen figured out the flow of the water, that the water goes back and forth. So they figured out if we put a net across that flow of water, we don't have to do anything. Fish will come into our net automatically. And so this fishing model has proved lucrative for generations. But because of changing climate conditions, changing in the flow of water, this traditional balance between biodiversity on one hand and the livelihoods has been thrown into a new mix. And CI has been trying to work with how can alternative livelihoods emerge to kind of fill this gap. And on top of this, kind of bringing in the carbon piece, we realized that with the help of a local university that is monitoring this region, that these sublakes, these 600 to 800 square kilometers of sublakes, is actually a huge store of wetland carbon. But there is no mechanism out there at the moment that allows us to protect that carbon from a climate mitigation perspective. And so we have really just started this journey of discovery if such a mechanism is possible. This overlap between freshwater and carbon is a very exciting and interesting space at the moment because we are trying to balance how we address the global need for climate mitigation, but also prepare local population for the climate impact they will see on their freshwater resources. And if we can find this intersection between freshwater and carbon, that makes our life much more easier. So I've been part of this study, which we are doing with the NASA Goddard Space Center, of mapping high-value freshwater ecosystems. We call them high-value freshwater ecosystems because we are not just focused on the lakes and the wetlands, but also the immediate terrestrial forests. So for example, the forests that sit on the source area of a river, or the forests in the floodplain that also filter some of the sediments and help with the water regulation. Once we were able to do this mapping, the great thing was with the global map, we were beginning to start to say, okay, where there's massive degradation. And so if there's massive degradation in those forests, then there's a direct restoration potential possible to bring in the carbon. This calculation is more a gut check for my team. It's a back of the envelope calculation kind of thing to make us sure that there is actually enough degraded riparian and headwater forests that if we restore, there's a strong overlap between freshwater and carbon. And the good/bad news is there is a lot of carbon that needs to be restored. The right half of those football, the greens and the pinks, are from Asia. And there's a lot of degradation there that needs to be addressed. As you've been hearing to me, and hopefully from my colleagues Saurav's and Siti's comments, what is coming across clearly is that we are at a stage where we need to move from doing project by project projects of fresh water to more looking at landscape. And this will require many shifts, like building a house and designing a township are slightly different skills. And we are at the stage where we need to think about many of those shifts. One of the shifts, since our topic today is transformative finance, is shifting our financial solutions. And there are many people in this audience who can probably help us think this through better. This is our current model that is largely used. We have philanthropic donors or corporate donors that give either CI or an organization like us a direct grant. We go and do the work, and hopefully we achieve what we all set out to achieve. Where we think we need to move is we need to make space for impact investors to come into this equation. And this is not just me speaking, but me talking to our conservation finance specialist at CI, so that working with the communities, we generate verified outcomes, like the volumetric water benefits that I talked about earlier. And this is when the corporates come in. They're actually paying for those verified outcomes to help us return the money to the investors. At beginning, as it looked to me, it might look like we are just playing musical chairs, moving people around. But actually, having investments come in upfront gives organizations like us purpose and scale-appropriate finance, so we can design the project for the landscape properly. And this is to something Saurav was touching upon, right? That we are able to think of which outcomes can come very quickly, maybe in a couple of years, which outcomes will take a few years to achieve, and we can design our work accordingly. It is beneficial for the communities because we are not engaging them on a project-by-project basis, but we are engaging them that this project is here to stay. It is for your landscape. It's going to be here for a long time. And finally, we feel it's also de-risking a little bit of the corporate's investment in us, because unlike giving us the money up front to kind of design and then actually implement the work, the corporates are only coming in at the outcome stage. And the added benefit will be this model will hopefully allow us to layer more financial, like from different corporates, from philanthropic benefits, and even hopefully at some point, public finance. I want to circle back to close on this image, because at freshwater conservation's heart is people. One thing that was really fascinating to me when I was in Darjeeling, that how aware the people were of the existential crisis they were facing in terms of water. And with that awareness, they used the resources they had to come up with an ingenious solution. It might not be the solution you or I like, but it does solve their problem for this time being. And that's what makes me excited about freshwater conservation in Asia. We clearly have huge challenges. But we also, as hopefully our presentations brought to you, have the building blocks for the solution that is possible. I hope that the ingenuity and the resources present in this room and our partners beyond will help us realize some of those solutions. And I'll leave that question to you, and hopefully we'll be able to talk at the reception afterwards of how we can make that possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Kashif. Please stay put on stage as we invite the moderator and the other panelists on stage for the panel discussion. The moderator for the discussion is Prashant Mahajan, Head for Ecosystems and Climate Change at Mandai Nature. And joining him and our speakers is Corina Chan, CEO of Singapore International Foundation and lead for the Southeast Asia Partnership for Adaptation Through Water, or SIPO. Prashant, when you're ready, the floor is yours.
Sure, thank you. And thank you to our speakers, Saurav, Dr. Siti, Dr. Kashif, for these visionary presentations. What struck me is how these projects, though distinct in focus, from the Eastern Himalayas, mountains to mangroves to blue carbon source to sea approach and freshwater conservation, are united by a common thread. That is the recognition that nature doesn't operate in silos, and neither can our solutions. I think I have some reflections, and I will take a couple of minutes to share those reflections. And Then we'll have some questions, and we'll also have, if time permits, we'll take some questions from the audience. So what I realized is interconnectedness as a guiding principle through these projects. Saura's work reminds us that protecting glaciers upstream safeguards water for billion people downstream, while Dr. Sithi's steel carbon concept challenges us to see mangrove not as an isolated ecosystem, but as a part of carbon flow system beginning in inland forests. And Dr. Kashif's freshwater model underscores that restoring nature isn't just about biodiversity, it's about securing water for 3.4 billion people. Is it 3.4 or 4.2? In the circle, we're 4.2. Wow. These narratives demand systemic thinking at policy, financing, and communities working across borders and sectors. So that's about interconnectedness. The second reflection I have is about scale and innovation in financing. And all three speakers highlighted the need for transformative capital. So there was 1 billion trees goal. Dr. Sithi's call for policy shift to protect carbon flows, and Dr. Kashif's pipeline of bankable projects, they all require blending philanthropy, private investment, and government action. This is not just about funding conservation, it's about funding economies where nature is the cornerstone of resilience and growth. So that's about scale and innovation in financing. And third reflection is about the human and nature nexus. These projects reject the false choice between development and conservation. Mountains to mangroves benefits billion livelihoods. Blue carbon ecosystems buffer storms for coastal communities. Freshwater restoration is a climate adaptation. And the question is not whether we can afford to invest in nature, it's whether we can afford not to. I think with this, we will move to our the panel discussion where we'll explore how to turn these ambitious visions into reality. Corina Chan's work with CPAW adds a critical layer. How regional partnerships can accelerate this transition. So let me ask a first question, Corina, about the regional cooperation as well as what's missing currently in regional cooperation to scale solutions like those discussed today. And I also want to ask you about what systemic hurdles, mainly the policy, financing, and governance, must we overcome to scale the models like this? Over to you.
Thank you, Prashant. Hello, everybody. Karina from the Singapore International Foundation. And CPAW is the Southeast Asia Partnership for Adaptation Through Water. So I'm shifting the discussion focus a bit. They all do very amazing work, very inspiring projects. But more often than not, to unlock the millions to support these projects, we need the thousands for convening. So CPAW is actually a convening platform. We look at adaptation through water. And why adaptation? I mean, we know the effects of climate change on nature biodiversity. A lot of focus have been on mitigation. In fact, I think over 95% of climate financing have gone to mitigation. Adaptation is really required. And why water? It's because 90% of adaptation work relates to water. And water is not just an SDG 6 issue. Water underpins all of the SDGs, which is why it's so related to freshwater, nature, biodiversity, conservation. So what CPAW hopes to do is a convening platform that brings together multi-sector stakeholders. And we are not talking about only the players in the water sector. We are talking about people and industries across agriculture, manufacturing, data centers, energy sector. These are heavy users of water. We talk about conservation of water. So bringing together the people who are in the industry, who uses water, bringing together people who have got the solutions and the knowledge to address the issues and challenges faced by the sectors, and more importantly, bringing together funders, people who have got the capability to do that. And what we talk a lot is, when we talk about cooperation cross-border, I think a lot hinges on the trust that funders need to have to ensure that whatever they invest in, especially they get the returns. This is not talking about philanthropic capital, which may go into supporting some of the pilot solutions. But when we talk about venture capitalists, when we talk about FIs coming in, asset owners coming in, they need to have certainty of the returns when they invest upfront. And I was just going to share an example. I mean, over lunch, someone was sharing that, this private investor invested in building the roads. They have an agreement, build roads, and of course, when you build roads infrastructure, the returns is, the toll that you get after that. But after building the roads, the government decided policy has changed, and they don't allow toll collection. And what happens? The company go bust because they have done all that upfront investment. So I think that's very important. When we talk about regional cooperation, data is very important, the sharing of data, and we're not talking only about public data, but local data is important in helping investors understand a bit more in terms of what's required. Yeah. So I stop here, but actually I wanted to also, before we go on, we have talked a lot about biodiversity, and I think there was a lot of talk about biodiversity credits that gone nowhere. But I really do think that we may need to think a bit more about water credits. Similar to carbon credits, I mean, carbon credits took us 20 to 30 years to actually make it happen. And if people don't start valuing water, fresh water and water that's required for industry, it's very hard to get the private sector in to look at water the way we should.
Yeah, that's quite an interesting idea of water credit, and definitely would like to learn more about it in due course. But I'll move to Saurav, and Saurav, mountains to mangrove spans 4 countries with diverse ecosystems, as well as they are different in terms of their political and ecological priorities that differ. So how do you design a unified strategy when you have different political and ecological priorities?
Probably the most exciting question of all. So I think today, the world is probably the most unstable it's been since the end of the Second World War, is today. Right? I think, second, South Asia has been a geopolitically complicated place for a very long time. Nature and climate both is top of the agenda for each of those countries. We've got countries like Bhutan that probably spearhead the agenda for nature conservation anywhere in the world, right? But cooperation on nature is not top of agenda for any of the 4 countries because they have things like migration, because they have things like trade barriers to overcome, right? On the other side of things, the world is also on fire, right? And we have limited time to act, right? So we need to be able to figure out ways by which we can get the job done, and we can get the job done as quickly and as impactfully as possible. So what Conservation International did is, A, we worked with organizations who've been working in these countries, in particular countries, for decades. All of their work is as per countries' policies and, in fact, adding to national targets. Right? We work with the biggest environmental NGO in India, we work with the biggest environmental NGO in Bhutan to enhance work towards the country's targets. What we hold and what we build collectively with organizations in the 4 countries is how do we stack impact? Where does impact have to be upstream? where do we need focused impact around the riverine ecosystems and where do we need focused impact along the mangroves so that we can create impact by the end of this decade, right? So that's what CI holds, and that is how we run a regional strategy by working with organizations based in country.
Oh, that's again challenging. It's not easy and straightforward. Thank you, Saurav. So I would now like to ask Dr. Siti about you argue that mangroves can't thrive without healthy rivers. What are key interventions, the inland interventions, that would most boost coastal blue carbon?
Whew, okay. I think halting deforestation, as I pointed out in my slides earlier, there's a lot of carbon that's being moved through these ecosystems, right? But what we have is a bit of a double whammy in blue carbon in coastal zones, which is that it's getting destroyed, right? We're facing impacts from the seaward side as well as the landward side. So it's that coastal squeeze, that's actually making it very difficult to act and, very difficult to act fast because we're losing these ecosystems. But at the same time, we're being impacted both from upstream as well as from the seaward side. So if we start to think about how we can remove some of those stressors and pressures, I think that's where we need to start. And it's not just, I focus today on very much the landward side because I think of the theme of this, right? But that's not to say that there's no pressures coming from the seaward side either, right? We have hydrodynamics, we have changes in coastal zones, the coastal zones itself, and then, we have whatever is happening upstream. But if we can actually just stop the deforestation upstream, that actually removes one of the problems that's impacting coastal blue carbon ecosystems. So when I talked earlier about how, if we have this massive deluge, of things coming through the river, of sediments, of carbon coming through the rivers, it naturally outstrips the ability of those coastal systems to absorb a lot of that carbon. Right? And so if they cannot absorb it, they get overwhelmed or they get, buried under, and then we lose those ecosystems. And when we lose those ecosystems, we're creating more problems for ourselves because then it releases all of this carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So I think, if we systematically think, and this is why this landscape approach is novel, but it's also great because whatever Saurav is doing upstream in the mountains, right, has direct impacts for how we manage our coastal systems, our coastal marine ecosystems.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, and then now moving on to Dr. Kashif about, you indicated that for scaling and stacking freshwater ecosystem restoration and protection solutions, a few other things also need to shift beside the financial solutions. So can you elaborate on a few?
I guess if you were listening to Saurav's presentation, you already start to see how much the system needs to change in other areas. So one of the things I'm doing actually in Mountains to Mangrove is implement our monitoring system for it. And you can imagine that if you are used to doing more restoration for 300 hectares, even 1,000 hectares, you can monitor even 10 hectares of that, which would be a significant percentage of the total area you're restoring. No sweat, right? You send a person there, and the conservation community is still pen and paper. They would go there, write down the numbers of trees they are seeing. These are saplings, X number of saplings, 50 big trees with a big tree trunk. Now imagine doing that over even, not going even to the 1 million hectares. Think about the 53,000 hectares that Saurav is talking about that we are doing already, started already. 53,000 hectares, easily that is more than 2,000 monitoring plots, each being monitored on a monthly basis for some things, or quarterly basis at minimum. So immediately the amount of data that is beginning to come in and the amount of actors, the one way is that you have one person hired for every field project, which is not practical. So we really have to change the way we collect that information, how we analyze it. We have to automate a large number of systems. We have a partner organization that we work with that is starting to use barcodes on these trees so that they don't even have to stop. They fly a drone through it and it scans the barcodes as it goes so that they can have a rough estimation of what's happening there. So the way we do, we really have to think about scale. And when it comes to planning, we are not just planning, because it will have material impacts of where we restore and where we don't restore once you start hitting scale. So all of those considerations, that pre-planning, understanding of what could be potential fallouts, what are the positive aspects that we want to actually drill down on, all of that becomes even more important when we start to look at large numbers.
Oh, and that's again very complex. Thank you. So all of you work across sectors, that is philanthropy, governments, corporates. I'm curious to know what's one unusual ally that could accelerate your goals. And I would like all of you to share that unusual ally that you can think of who would unlock the potential of your goals. Corina, you want to start?
Well, I was going to share one stakeholder group, but I think CI has done it very well because I was sitting through the 3 presentations, and in all your projects, you actually do engage the local community very well. And I think that is, I wouldn't call it unusual ally, but important ally, because when you do this work, their buy-in is needed, because if not, you can do a one-off, and it's not sustainable. So I would think that community engagement, the local stakeholders is very important, and this is an area that CI has done very well across all projects that I know of.
I actually think we need collaboration along a lot of people and organizations delivering development work in the region. And I'll give you an example. I think I spoke earlier about our NGO partners in Bangladesh, who call the Friendship NGO, right? Who have been a healthcare-focused NGO for the last 3 decades. And the reason why they are now focusing a lot of their energies and monies in planting mangroves is because they've seen that planting mangroves is probably one of the most cost-efficient and resilient ways of allowing for life to exist for coastal communities, right? That was a completely unexpected ally. And I think because the world is on fire, I'll repeat this till someone takes the mic away. Because the world is on fire, we need to work together with other organizations who are saving lives and allowing people to do agriculture and allowing for fresh water to exist. Because we're all trying to ensure that we are able to live and that other people are able to live on this earth, right? And we really have a joint mission, and that's what I think that's the message that we have to hammer home with speed.
I'm going to be boring and just reiterate what I said in my presentation, but I think I'm going to frame it differently. So when blue carbon wasn't a thing until about 15 years ago, right? I think one of the first times blue carbon was brought up at one of these UN COPs. I think they were practically laughed off stage because all the forest people were like, ha ha, no. And so, you know, when we started doing the science and we started bringing the policy together to show how, you know, you can actually connect mitigation actions to the conservation and restoration of blue carbon, you know, and it started becoming a big thing. It's, you know, gained a lot of popularity, and the science shows that, you know, it can store 3 to 5 times more carbon than rainforests, for example, right? People started pitching blue carbon against forest carbon. And I keep telling everybody, it's not like you can choose to conserve one without the other. This is a global problem. It's a very linked landscape. You cannot choose one and you're like, no, I'm not gonna conserve fresh water, or I'm not gonna plant trees in the Himalayas because I'm only gonna do blue carbon, right? And people tell me, where should I put my money? And I say, you know, you need to do, this is a crisis, right? It's a climate crisis. You really need to be doing everything, everywhere, all at once, to quote a favorite Michelle Yeoh movie. But I think it's not, I guess it's not an unexpected ally, but it was made an enemy when it really should be framed as an ally.
Thank you. Okay.
I'm actually go back to what Corinne said. So, although yes, CI does focus a lot on working with communities, I'm constantly blown away, as I probably talked in a bit about, like with the communities in China, the communities in India that I came with, that the ingenuity and the resourcefulness they show. And you know, community engagement is an art, co-creation of work is an art. And I think CI has taken very good first steps, but there's still a lot more to be learned from there and done there. And I'm constantly excited of how we continue to transfer that ownership of the work we do to the grassroots.
Great, thank you. Yeah. There are a couple of questions from the audience, and I'm going to check who would like to answer them. So the first question is about, it's about financing or monetization. So what are some monetization methods to drive conservation as opposed to relying on good intentions from corporate and philanthropies?
Well, the first one, the obvious one that I mentioned is the volumetric water benefits analysis. At least in the water work, that has been very, very crucial. It's a few steps away from a water credit, but it has, because of the third-party verification system it has built in, and the clear voice that is coming from the CEO mandate about the need for accounting for the water risks and water targets in corporations, it has something special there, I think, that has brought corporates and NGOs in a common ground. Of course, more needs to be done. Hopefully, someday we will. Someday soon, I should not say someday, so forever. Someday soon we will see water restoration credits or the like arising, but having that very specific way of articulating benefits and tracking them over time, having then strengthening the methodology and monitoring behind it, I think is one mechanism where it kind of moves away from being a very, what was the word in the question that was said, that very just, yeah, it's a nice thing to do, I'll give you some money kind of thing, but it is really counting against the corporate's bottom line.
Can I?
Yeah, sure.
So, because Kashiv mentioned credits, I think, you know, the specter of carbon credits literally sits above us, because Gen Zero was having this whole conversation upstairs about how to revive the voluntary carbon market, right? And I think, you know, the thing people think about when we say blue carbon is that they think about carbon, and therefore they, by extension, think about carbon credits. And while we have done a lot of work, and it's an amazing body of work if you really look at it and think about the scale and the number of sectors that we had to bring in and the interdisciplinary approaches that were deployed, I think while we have made carbon financing work for blue carbon in certain situations, what's become evident when we look across the world to look for more of these, you know, project sites per se, is that it's not going to work in every situation. So I think that's where this innovative financing, like where else can we, you know, generate revenue streams, what other innovative finance can we deploy in order to have, you know, more blended financing in the work that we do, right? And going on this week, and I'm gonna make a shameless pitch here, is a challenge called the Blue Carbon Plus. And it's a collaboration amongst the two biggest, you know, well, two of the big ones. I'm going to get wrapped on the knuckles later. But anyway, it's a collaboration between Conservation International and the Nature Conservancy. And what we're looking for is business models that work in blue carbon ecosystems. So it's business models where whatever you're producing inherently has the conservation of blue carbon ecosystems in what is being produced. So the best equivalent we have is shade-grown coffee, where you're growing coffee in rainforest. And so what is the business model that has conservation inherent in, say, the beans being produced? What is that equivalent for blue carbon ecosystems? So we really need to think about like these more innovative financing solutions, right? And there's a few out there, right, that people have tested. There's parametric insurance, there's Risco, etc. But what's really evident is that there is not one financing solution that's going to be a silver bullet for everything, right? Most of the time, it's going to have to be this hodgepodge because the problems we deal with aren't all from the same source. Right? And so like thinking about it at this landscape scale and then thinking about how to finance, the different segments of it, but bringing it all together to show the benefits across these landscapes, I think that's the key.
That's right. I mean, building on the innovative finance, Corina, you mentioned about water credits. So what are the steps required to reach the water credit to the stage where the carbon credits are today?
Shall I say it's a moonshot? Well, actually, if you look at carbon credit and its journey, right? I mean, it took a net zero rallying point for people to really look at carbon credit, NDCs, and Paris Agreement. So I think what we look at for water credit is there a rallying point for water? And it all starts with, do people value water? Because, we talk about non-revenue water, water losses. In some countries, water is free. In some countries, you have subsidies, overly subsidized water. So if you don't start to value water, I don't think we are going to get there. Yeah. And we can talk about water credit, but, carbon credit already has a framework. And can we build on that framework and stack on water credit? Because more often than not, if you look at carbon, there is a water side of the story. So, I mean, it's a very long shot. Yeah. And until people realizes the value of water and have a common goal, similar to net zero, it's going to be challenging. But over at CPOR, we are starting initial discussions on that, working with stakeholders who are keen to explore this further. So it's something that we are happy to talk to and work with anyone who is interested. But when we look at financing, I just take a minute because it goes back to the project. And for each project, you have different stakeholders. And if you look at, for example, if I talk about rice, stakeholders are the farmers. If I want to change the way they grow rice to be sustainable, what is in it for them to grow rice sustainably, hence water and conservation, right? It's not about convincing the private sector to, fund more, they need this equipment and that equipment, but what is in it for the farmers themselves. So innovative way of thinking, how do we assure them that their livelihoods are stable if they grow rice using drip irrigation instead of flooding the rice field is good for them? Then we will need to think further, okay, maybe guaranteed offtake is something that you want. So these are the various ways that we can think beyond traditional financing. We can talk about blended finance and all that, but really look at project per se and really look at who this project is meant to help. And from their point of view, what is it that they see as financing that is relevant to them?
Sure. Thank you so much. I think we are running out of time, and I just want to end this panel with your last question, your final thought, and one concrete step the audience can take. Maybe, Dr. Kashif, would you like to start?
Final thought. Let's try to save freshwater ecosystems, I guess. Yeah.
That's a cop-out.
Well, as we saw in all the presentations, even Corinne's remarks, right? I'll go back to what I was saying, that we have the building blocks. We have the building blocks, we have nice examples, we have case studies in the world to look at of how we can continue to work in this space and improve. What really is required is that we start looking at freshwater ecosystems in context of the entire system, the watershed, how these water services are delivered to the people. And it will require us to have a more holistic vision of what water management looks like. I'm a water engineer by profession, and I kind of sneaked into the conservation movement. Thinking back of my own education as a water engineer, what kinds of transformation is required in my alma mater in a way, so that we can address these challenges more holistically.
Okay, thank you. Siddhi?
Okay, so given that we're at the Philanthropy Asia Summit, I think my takeaway is that piecemeal giving will get you piecemeal actions. Large-scale giving will give you large-scale actions. And if you're looking for impact at scale, it needs to happen collectively.
Thank you. Okay.
I'll actually take on from CD here and say that I think for everyone in this room to realize how your philanthropic dollars actually help unlock like truly exponential and transformational change. And I think like some of you in this room have actually contributed into the Mountains to Mangroves program. And you can probably see the scale that you've enabled, but also the scale in 3 years that you have helped unlock. So thank you, and look forward to having many chats soon.
Very quick one. I think, start looking at the hydrological cycle as a global common good, and co-create solutions that we think is good for SDGs, all the SDGs. I mean, over at CPOR, we are a member-led convening platform. All the projects are led by members. They bring to the table what they are working on, and they garner additional feedback in terms of the challenges that they meet, what additional solutions, what kind of funding is required. So, I mean, happy to talk to anyone who's interested.
Great. And on that note, I think it's been a very inspirational and very thought-provoking presentation and the discussion. Please join me in thanking the panel for this wonderful session and for your inputs. I know we had a few more questions, which we could discuss over a reception when we break from this session. Thank you very much again.
Thank you very much to Prashant and our panelists for this very enlightening discussion. And this brings us to the close of our session, and we would like to invite everyone on stage, as well as our audience, to a networking reception at the back of the room. Thank you again for joining Conservation International today.